So if you listen to Chapter 1, you know where we left off. 7 days in the house. A family of 6 trying to convince themselves that what they were experiencing had a rational explanation. Elias, awake at 3 in the morning, listening to his own voice come out of the wall, saying his own name back to him, like a greeting, like a welcome home. What I'm about to tell you is what happened over the following 2 weeks. And I want to be upfront with you. This is where the story stops being something you can write off as old pipes or acoustic quirks, or the particular way that wind moves through a structure that's over 100 years old. This is where the house stopped being strange and started being something else entirely. This is where it learned their names. Sarah was the researcher in the family. That was her nature, her training, her default response to anything she didn't understand: document it, source it, trace it back to its origin. So while Elias was mapping the warm patches on the walls and Leo was setting up audio recorders in every room, Sarah was doing what she did best. She was pulling records. Property records first, then county archives, then a digitized archive of the Morrow's Bluff Courier, the local paper, which had been running in some form since 1887 and whose back issues had been partially scanned by a historical society volunteer sometime around 2015. God bless her, whoever she was. What Sarah found over the course of 3 days of searching was not dramatic. There was no single headline, no smoking gun, no one article that explained everything. It was more like a pattern, the kind of pattern that only becomes visible when you've gathered enough individual data points and stepped far enough back to see the shape they make together. 3 families before the Hargroves. She'd known that from Donna the realtor. What she hadn't known was the specifics. The first family, a couple with 1 child, had moved in 2011 and filed a missing persons report for their 8-year-old son 14 months later. The boy was found 2 days after the report was filed, wandering a field about a mile from the house, unharmed physically, but according to the one article that covered it, non-responsive and unable to account for the preceding 36 hours. The family moved out within a month. The article was 4 paragraphs long and buried on page 7. The second family lasted 8 months. No incident on record. They simply left. Sarah found 1 letter to the editor of the Courier from that period, submitted by a woman who gave only her first name, Ruth, complaining about noise ordinance violations from the property on Route 9 outside of town. She described, in a letter that the editor had clearly chosen to print more out of small-town amusement than journalistic merit, hearing voices coming from the fields at night, speaking in the voices of people I know, saying things those people would never say. The third family, the most recent occupants before the Hargroves, had left so recently that Sarah found a Facebook post about it. A woman venting to her friends about the nightmare of their move, about leaving most of their furniture because they needed to get out fast, about her kids not sleeping, about sounds in the walls that the landlord refused to investigate. The post was 18 months old. It had 9 comments, mostly sympathetic, and one from the woman's mother that just said, "I told you that house was wrong." Sarah printed everything, put it in a folder, set the folder on her desk in the study, and sat looking at it for a long time. Then she went to find Elias. He was in the basement. The Hargrove farmhouse had a full basement, unusual for a structure of its era in that part of Indiana, accessed by a door off the kitchen. Elias had been using it mostly for storage during the move-in, but he'd also been spending time down there for a reason he hadn't fully explained to Sarah yet. The basement walls, like the walls upstairs, had that unusual double cavity construction. But down here, the interior surface wasn't drywall or plaster. It was the original material, something that Elias had identified as an early form of compressed fiber panel, installed in roughly 1-foot sections across the entire surface of every wall. Most of it was intact. Some of it had degraded at the edges, peeling away from the framing beneath in curling strips. Behind one section, in the northeast corner of the basement, the panel had come away from the wall entirely, exposing the cavity behind it. And what was in that cavity was not dead air. It was a material Elias had never seen before and couldn't immediately identify. It lined the interior surface of the outer wall, about a 1/4 inch thick, covering every square inch of the cavity's exposed face. It was dark gray, slightly textured, with a surface that reminded him, and this was the word he used in his voice memo, said with the careful reluctance of a person who knows how something sounds before they say it. It reminded him of membrane. Specifically, of the membrane you find stretched across the interior of an acoustic instrument. Dried, preserved, but the same essential structure. Organic, it was organic material, lining the inside of the wall cavity like skin. He'd been trying to determine what it was for 3 days. When Sarah came down the basement stairs and found him crouched in the northeast corner with a flashlight, she asked him what he was looking at. He showed her. She took one look and said, "We need to talk about what I found." They sat on the basement steps for an hour, going through her folder together. When they were done, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Elias looked at the exposed wall cavity in the corner and said quietly, "It's not insulation." Sarah said, "No. It's a recording surface," he said. "The whole wall, that material, it's been absorbing sound for over 100 years. Sarah asked him what he meant. He said, "Think about how magnetic tape works, how vinyl records work. Sound is vibration. Vibration is energy. Under the right conditions, with the right material, that energy can be stored, physically stored in the structure of the material itself, and then, under the right conditions, released." Sarah said, "That's not how physics works, Elias." He looked at the wall. "I know," he said. That same evening, the mimicry started in earnest. It was a little after 6. Elias was upstairs with Leo. The twins were in their room. Maya was in the kitchen doing homework at the table. Sarah was in the study, on her laptop, and had just gotten up to get a glass of water when she heard it. Elias' voice, coming from the direction of the basement door. "Sarah." Clear, conversational. His exact voice, the specific warm flatness of it, the way he said her name with a slight emphasis on the first syllable that was entirely particular to him. She walked to the kitchen. Looked at the basement door, it was closed. She called back, "Yeah." "Nothing." She opened the basement door, dark at the bottom of the stairs. She called down, no answer. She turned around and walked back toward the hallway, and nearly ran into Elias, who was coming down the stairs from the second floor with a coffee mug in his hand, Leo a step behind him. She said, "Were you just in the basement?" He said he hadn't been in the basement since that afternoon. She said, "I heard you call my name." He looked at the basement door, then at the kitchen wall, then at her. And she said that something crossed his face in that moment, not fear exactly, more like the expression of a man who had been running a calculation in the back of his mind for several days and had just arrived at an answer he really didn't want. He set his coffee mug on the counter and said, very carefully, "Where exactly did it sound like it was coming from?" She pointed at the wall beside the basement door. He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something. Leo, who was 15 and had been running audio recorders for a week, and had the unsettling attentiveness of a kid who'd been quietly absorbing more than his parents realized, said, "It's been practicing." They had a family meeting that night, all 6 of them at the kitchen table. Elias and Sarah had agreed beforehand to be honest with the kids without being alarmist, which is a balance that is very hard to strike when what you're being honest about is that your house appears to be alive and learning to imitate your voices. They explained what they knew, the wall construction, the organic material in the basement, Sarah's research on the previous families, the recordings Leo had made. They did not mention the missing 8-year-old from 2011. They did mention that the house had some unusual acoustic properties that they were still trying to understand. Maya listened with her arms crossed and the particular expression of a 16-year-old who knows she's not being told everything, but is choosing to accept the partial version for now. Leo had his phone on the table, recorder running. Of course he did. Ben sat very still and said nothing. Chloe kept looking at the wall. After Elias finished talking, Chloe said, "They know our names already." The table went quiet. Sarah asked her what she meant. Chloe said it matter-of-factly, with the complete absence of drama that made it somehow so much worse. The voices in the wall. They were saying our names today, all of our names. They were practicing. Elias asked her when she'd heard this. "This afternoon," she said. "Me and Ben were listening. They know Daddy's name and Mommy's name and Maya's name and Leo's name and our names. They were going through them, like a list." Ben, who had still said nothing, looked up from the table and said, "They got Chloe's wrong at first, but they fixed it." Leo's recordings from that week were extraordinary. He'd set up 6 phones and a small digital recorder that he'd borrowed from his dad's workshop, distributed through the main floor and the upstairs hallway. He checked them every morning and every evening, going through the audio files with a patience and methodical attention that Elias told me, later, he hadn't fully appreciated in his son until that moment. What the recordings revealed, compiled over 4 days, was something that Leo laid out for his parents on the kitchen table one evening with a handwritten chart and a timeline. He explained it the way he'd present a school project, calmly, in order, letting the data speak. First finding, the voices in the walls were not random. They followed patterns. Certain sounds, footsteps, laughter, the particular creak of the 3rd step on the staircase, consistently preceded vocal activity in the walls. It was as if movement in the house was triggering the walls to speak. Second finding, the vocal content of the walls wasn't just replaying old recordings. Some of what the walls were saying was new. Specifically, and Leo had gone back and verified this 3 times before including it in his presentation, some of the voices in the walls were speaking conversations that hadn't happened yet. He'd captured, on the recorder in the upstairs hallway, a clear exchange between what sounded like Elias and Sarah. Voices, he said, that were close but not quite right, like a slightly imperfect imitation, discussing something about the basement, using specific details that, as of the date of that recording, no one in the family had spoken about out loud. 2 days later, Elias and Sarah had almost exactly that conversation. Third finding, and this was the one that made Sarah put her hand over her mouth and look away from the chart. The walls had a complete vocal signature for every member of the family. Leo had isolated individual voice samples that the walls had produced, one for each of the 6 Hargroves, and played them back. They were precise. Maya's slight upward inflection at the end of sentences. Leo's habit of pausing before proper nouns. The twins' near-identical vocal qualities, distinguished only by Chloe's slightly higher register, Elia's particular cadence, and Sarah's voice, played back through the wall of her own house, saying her own name in a tone she said she'd never used. Curious, exploratory, like something learning what it had caught. Leo set down his chart and said, "I think it's been recording us since we got here, and I think it's almost done." Elias asked, "Almost done with what?" Leo said, "I don't know, but it feels like it's been building something." Earl Prout came on a Sunday. None of them had seen him before. He simply appeared at the front door at around 4 in the afternoon. A man in his late 70s, lean and weathered, wearing a Carhartt jacket and a feed store cap with the brim shaped into a tight curve. His hands, when he raised one to knock, were notable. The right hand was missing the index and middle fingers. Cleanly, the skin over the stumps long healed to smooth scar tissue. He held his remaining fingers in a slightly splayed configuration, the way people do when they're compensating for absent ones without thinking about it anymore. Elias answered the door. The old man looked past Elias into the house before he said anything, like he was checking on something. Then he looked at Elias and said, "You the new family." It wasn't a question. Elias said yes and asked what he could do for him. The old man said his name was Earl Prout, and he had a farm about 2 miles up the county road, and he'd been meaning to come by since he'd heard the house had new occupants. He asked if he could come in. Elias, because Elias was a fundamentally polite Midwestern man, stood aside and let him in. Earl stood in the front hallway and did something strange. He stood very still, eyes half closed, and listened. Not to anything in particular that Elias could hear, just listened to the house. After about 15 seconds of this, he made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a sigh. Sarah had come out of the study. Leo was at the top of the stairs. Earl looked at all of them in turn, and then he said, with the directness of a man who has decided he doesn't have time to be indirect, "It's further along with you than it usually gets this fast." Elias asked him what he meant. Earl said, "The house, it's already in your voices, isn't it?" Not a question. Elias said, "What do you know about this house?" Earl looked at the wall beside them, the front hallway wall, one of the warm ones, and said, "I know it collects people. First it takes your voice, gets to know the sound of you. Every family that's come through here, that's how it starts. The sounds first, then it wants the rest." Sarah said, "The rest of what?" Earl looked at her steadily and said, "You." The hallway was very quiet. Then Leo's phone, sitting on the console table by the front door, produced a sound. They all looked at it. The screen was dark, nothing running. But through the speaker, faint, slightly distorted, with that particular compressed quality they all recognized by now, came a voice. Earl Pruitt's voice, saying the exact words he had spoken 30 seconds ago. "First it takes your voice, gets to know the sound of you." Earl looked at the phone, then at the wall, then back at Elias, and he said very quietly, "It's listening right now, it's always listening." He looked at his right hand, the hand with the missing fingers, and he said, "You need to understand what you're dealing with before someone goes into that wall. Because once you go in, what comes back out isn't always all of you." He didn't stay long after that. He said he'd come back, that there were things he needed to explain that he wasn't ready to explain yet, things he needed to think about how to say. He gave Elias a phone number written on the back of a receipt and told him to call if anything changed suddenly. Elias asked him what changed suddenly would look like. Earl stopped at the door and said, "If one of your kids stops sleeping, or if you start hearing your own voice somewhere it shouldn't be and the voice sounds wrong, sounds like it's trying to understand what it's saying but doesn't quite, or if one of them," he glanced toward the stairs where Leo had been standing, "stops being afraid of the wall and starts being comfortable with it." He looked at the wall one more time, then he left. They stood in the hallway, in silence for a moment. Then, from behind the wall, from inside the dead air, in a voice that was unmistakably Earl Pruitt's, aged and measured and flat, "You need to understand what you're dealing with." A pause. And then, in a voice none of them recognized, something that was trying to be Earl's voice but hadn't fully gotten there yet, something that had the shape of a human voice without the warmth of one. "We understand." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m, she got up and went to her study, opened her laptop, pulled up her research folder. She went back through Leo's audio files, the ones he'd shared with her, listening through earbuds, going chronologically. The early recordings from the first week, the faint music, the counting child, the overlapping voices she couldn't parse. Then the more recent ones, the imitations, the predictions, the sound of her own name spoken in her own voice in a register she'd never used. She listened to that last one 3 times. Then she opened a new document and began typing notes, because that was what she did when she was frightened. She documented. She was 3 paragraphs in when she heard it. Her own voice, coming from the study wall, the thick wall, the one she'd always found so comfortably silent. Coming from right behind the plaster, close and clear, as if something had pressed itself against the interior surface of the dead air space and was speaking directly through the material. And her voice, assembled from fragments, from the recordings the house had been taking since day one, stitched together into something new, said, "I'm already inside. I've been inside since the first night." Sarah sat completely still. The study was silent. She looked at the wall for a long time. Then she saved her document, closed her laptop, and went upstairs and lay down next to Elias and stared at the ceiling until morning. She didn't tell him what she'd heard, not that night, because she'd recognized something in her own voice as the wall spoke it. Some quality, some undertone. It wasn't just her voice. It was a version of her voice that understood something she didn't yet. That knew something about this house and what it wanted that she hadn't figured out yet. And the most frightening part, the part she wrote about later in a letter she sent me in her careful researcher's handwriting, was that it didn't sound threatening. It sounded patient, like it had been waiting a very long time for exactly the right family to arrive. And now that they were here, all 6 of them, voices cataloged, signatures complete, the waiting was finally over.